Welcome to the Gridiron Expert. Next up on our team previews, we're going to be looking at the Florida Gators. And joining us on the channel to talk more about the Gators this fall is Graham Hall. Graham, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. You can read my stuff over at Swamp 247, part of the 247 Sports Network. I've been covering the Gators going on. This is my 11th season. Still feels like just yesterday that I was in college. Time really flies, but this is a really exciting season for Florida. A lot of depth and a potential Heisman Trophy candidate in DJ Lagway.
Well, let's go ahead and roll into this team, starting off with DJ Lagway. Do you think that if he's healthy, and of course we'll get into his health status here as well, but if he's healthy, do you think Lagway might be or might have, I should say, the highest ceiling of all quarterbacks for 2025?
I think it's certainly fair to say. I think that there's certainly some quarterbacks, a ton of quarterbacks who have the experience over him. And that is certainly a question that we're going to look to see. How is DJ Lagway going to look when teams have had a full offseason to prepare for him? There's film out there about him available now. And yeah, in terms of his health, are you really going to be able to get the full DJ Lagway experience? Because you remember last year, you saw glimpses of it. Obviously, he had a great game against Samford. No offense to Samford. That's probably the weakest team that Florida faced last year. And then when he returned and took over that starting role when Graham Mertz unfortunately had a second straight season ending injury, DJ Lagway was fantastic as well. But then he suffers that grade 2 hamstring strain. And you really see his game, I think, a little bit protected is a good way to say it. But they weren't able to really use him to his full capabilities. He wasn't out there taking off and running. He was playing on a hamstring that was limiting his mobility and that he was feeling every time he stepped into his throws. So staying healthy so that he can provide you with that dynamic athleticism, dual threat ability, even though he is a pure passer, a guy who is comfortable in the pocket, throwing on the run, would obviously prefer to launch at 60 yards and take off in the open field and take contact, but he's certainly able to do that. But I think the big questions about him are still related to his health because he was modified in spring practice. You saw him not throw at all during spring camp, even though head coach Billy Napier has now come out and said that he's on track to be ready by fall camp, that he's going to participate in OTAs when they begin in the first week of June, and that he's back to now throwing 3 times per week. I do think that he missed out on valuable practice time in spring camp where he had a chance to go into spring camp and be the leader, continue working on some of his, in-game aspects that left a little bit to be desired. He can cut down on the turnovers, do better against zone coverage as well next season. So there certainly are some things that you would have liked to see him benefit from in spring. And now there definitely is a question of how healthy is he going to be moving forward when the 2025 season arrives. Florida is optimistic, but I do think it certainly is a question still out there.
Do you think that his health is as much of a question as like what Cam Rising's health was for Utah last year, or do you not think it's going to be like that much of a concern?
I don't think it's going to be as much of a concern. I think a lot of what he's dealing with is going to be a pain management issue. Now, certainly, if he takes one bad hit, then we're having a different conversation here. But I do think that all signs point to him being able to throw the ball, even if he's in still a little bit of discomfort, which I want to make sure that I'm reiterating. That's some just speculation in a sense. We don't know. Only DJ Lagway knows how his body's going to feel when he goes out there and throws it 100 times and goes through a pregame warm up and takes contact, and he's playing at a lot more of a high rate there and going through practice and walkthroughs. I think there's going to be some management issues with making sure that he doesn't have what happened to him last year. If you remember how his first fall camp in Gainesville went, by the time that the season opener arrived against Miami, he was dealing with some discomfort. It led to him have a limited role in that 41-17 loss against Miami, and he came out and acknowledged that just the amount of work that he was doing in fall camp and how much he was throwing led to him feeling a little bit of some soreness. And so I think managing that is something that you're going to want to see. You're going to want to, see how that plays out. And I think it's something you're going to see Florida choose to do this upcoming season because they got to make sure that, speculating here again, say he does need surgery in the off season. They're banking on him getting through the entire 2025 season and just managing that injury and putting all that off towards after the season. So I do think it's going to be something that, as of right now, sitting here talking in mid-May, that you're going to expect him to be able to play and manage that injury. Now, he's going to have to get through a lot before the season gets here. We're still, 3.5 months away. But right now, I fully expect him to be out there for the August 30th season opener against Long Island.
If injuries do happen to occur in the quarterback room this season, is Harrison Bailey likely to be the backup quarterback here? The former Tennessee UNLV guy?
I think that was the expectation that a lot of people had when you bring in someone from the transfer portal, a veteran quarterback, a little bit of a journeyman in a sense. You bring him in, and I think that you're expecting him to be the backup quarterback. But from what I've heard talking to people with Inside Florida's building, Aiden Warner, the preferred walk-on quarterback from Winter Park, who now has been elevated to scholarship, but he was a preferred walk-on during spring camp. What I've heard is that right now, if the season were to begin today, Aiden Warner would be the backup quarterback. Where if TJ Lagway went down, you would have Aiden Warner, a redshirt sophomore who transferred from Yale last season and was rehabbing a torn ACL this time a year ago. He would be the backup quarterback with Harrison Bailey as the third string quarterback, and Tramel Jones Jr., the freshman that they added who flipped from Florida State back in, I think, October or November of last year. He would be the fourth string quarterback. So obviously that can change in the coming months, but I do think from what I've heard that Florida hoped to see a little bit more from Harrison Bailey, that he still has a little ways to go. This is a guy that it was told to me at the end of spring camp that you would maybe expect him to be a little more polished right now, given his experience, that he's been in an SEC program before than he is right now. So I know a lot of people out there have said that Harrison Bailey is the backup quarterback, but that's just not tracking with what I've heard. Obviously, it can change, but as of right now, I am fully of the belief that Aiden Warner is the backup quarterback.
And in terms of collegiate experience, this quarterback room actually has a lot here because there's also, is it Clay Millen from formerly Nevada, Colorado State? I think he's what, like fourth maybe or fifth here in the room.
Yeah, he's fifth. We'll have to see what happens with Clay Millen. You know, a tough situation for him. He was brought in a former starter, and he was competing for that third string role last year and got beat out by Aiden Warner. Um, and then you bring in a promising quarterback like Tramel Jones, who took more reps throughout the spring. I don't know if Clay Millen will ever take a snap at Florida. Maybe he's kind of a dire straits type quarterback where, God forbid, if you're Florida, you see four quarterbacks go down with injuries, and what choice do you have, right? You turn to Clay Millen. But this is a guy who I would not expect to be in the equation to see the field for the Gators this year due to just guys being ahead of him. And, I would not be even shocked if in 3 months we're looking back and Clay Millen, maybe we'll see what happens. I'm not reporting anything here, but maybe he's not even part of the roster, a guy who's graduating soon, I believe this summer, and maybe he chooses to pursue other opportunities. I just don't think he's so far out of the equation of seeing the field that it really is those four I just mentioned before him, Lagway, Warner, Bailey, and Tramel Jones, that are going to be taking snaps if they need to go to someone else other than DJ Lagway this season.
Looking throughout the Gator skill core for this coming fall, I see like potential breakthrough here. A lot of breakthrough players, a lot of noteworthy, talented players here in the skill positions, and we'll look towards the receiving core here. So, J. Michael Sturdivant transfers in from UCLA, formerly at Cal. Uh, Sturdivant didn't exactly have great quarterback play the last couple of years at UCLA, but he did really good at Cal in his freshman year. So again, he transfers in. Eugene Wilson's still there. There's a lot of really fast underclassmen here in the 2 and 3 deep. So take me through this receiving core. I mean, speed, speed, speed in this receiving core, it looks like.
Yeah, I'll start with J. Michael Sturdivant because I think that's someone that is very slept on. You don't see him mentioned as a impact transfer in the SEC, but I do think that he's going to step in and be a starter for the jump for this Florida team. I just think he's too talented. He's got fantastic speed along with his size, has worked tremendously hard since he got here. Like you said, he didn't have great quarterback play the last couple of years at UCLA. You team him up with a guy like DJ Lagway, who just showed explosive play after another last year. And I do think that this is a guy who has a chance to break out. And I think for Florida's coaching staff, when you look at who they have identified as transfer wide receivers in recent years, I mean, I think that the results speak for themselves. From bringing in Ricky Pearsall 2 years ago, who, a guy who ended up being a first round pick in the NFL draft, to last year you bring in Chimere Dike and Elijah Badger, two guys who combined for over 1,500 yards. Dike ends up becoming a fourth round wide receiver taken by the Tennessee Titans, and Elijah Badger, one of the first undrafted free agents that you saw called after the draft. And there were some analysts out there, including here at CBS Sports, who have predicted Badger to be the most impactful undrafted free agent that has signed with a team. So I do think that what Florida has done in the transfer portal with adding talent at wide receiver, you got to believe that they know what they're doing here, right? Their evaluations speak for themselves. And I think that Sturdivant is a guy who is going to absolutely showcase that he was under recruited out of the transfer portal. And based on everything I've heard, this is a guy who was proving himself in the NFL before he chose to come to Florida and try and build his stock up rather than try and catch on with the team as an undrafted free agent. So I think that he's going to be a starter. Obviously, you mentioned Eugene Wilson III. That is someone who has been captivating for the last 2 years. But if there's been any more headlines regarding Eugene Wilson than his athleticism and playmaking ability, it's been his inability to stay healthy. So last year, he had the surgery on his hip that was a congenital issue that, dealing with something his entire life and just needed to have surgery to take care of it. Can he be more explosive? He's already added weight to his frame. I think that they're banking on him staying healthy and having a really, really good year. I think that he's going to start from the jump as well. I don't want to miss anyone because there's certainly some guys, some second, some third-year guys around Wilson and Sturdivant, guys like Aiden Mizell, who you saw against Mississippi State, just tremendous speed, a former track guy. I
That was a
think that
bad
he's
call
going
in
to
that game with the blind side
I
play.
I agree. I agree. Florida was, a little upset about that. If there was anyone more upset about it than Florida, it was probably Mizell's father, who has been waiting to see his son, show people what he can do. And I think this is going to be a year where he has elevated opportunities to do that. But again, loaded at wide receiver, Florida is. And then, Tank Hawkins is someone last year that you saw stand out as a freshman, a guy who hit 23 miles per hour, has benefited from being in spring camp again and adding to his frame. I think that he's just, he's going to command targets. I think the guy just gets open. And even if he's used as, a backup wide receiver, part of the 2 or 3 deep, I think that you're going to see him take the field as well. Guys like TJ Abrams as well are going to be in the mix. We'll have to see how much Florida is able to get out of Khalil Jackson, a guy who was a starter for Florida at the beginning of last season, suffered a torn ACL, and has been working his way back for the previous 9 months. Is that going to be someone who factors into this rotation at wide receiver? I mean, he's a big body guy, good speed, great hands, good catch radius, targets the ball well in the air, does just everything well that you would like. And I do think that, they're going to find some way to get him on the field as well. But everyone always loves talking about the shiny new toys. And I do think that that is something that at wide receiver, Florida's most recent signing class, you're going to see them make the most impact at the wide receiver position. You look at Vernell Brown III, another legacy guy who comes in, had Ohio State in the mix, Alabama, Georgia, Miami, comes to Florida, follows his father's footsteps in a sense, and coming to Gainesville and trying to carve out his own path. I think this is someone who, if you haven't watched his film out there, I encourage everyone out there to go out there and watch. I mean, his ability to high point the ball and just make tremendous catches in the air, and his combination of athleticism and how hard of a worker he is, it's hard for me to see him not utilized and play every single game this upcoming season. I just think he's poised to be a dynamic freshman, but he may not even be the most talented freshman wide receiver the Gators added. Dallas Wilson was someone that Florida was really making a really hard push for on the recruiting trail. He ends up signing with Oregon. The rest is history. He gets asked to be released from a signed financial affidavit by the Ducks, comes to Gainesville, and he was absolutely the standout player in spring camp for the Gators. He had 10 receptions for 195 yards and 2 touchdowns in the spring game. He set multiple spring game records. His combination of size, athleticism, he's incredibly tough to cover in the open field. This is someone who just is a mismatch for you and so ahead of the game, just a natural athlete. He's going to be on the field for Florida. I don't know if he's going to start right away. If he's out, I mean, I don't know if he's going to be out there for the first snap, but he is going to be used at a high rate and targeted consistently from the jump as a freshman for Florida. I think he has a chance to absolutely be one of the most standout, impressive freshmen in all the SEC, if not the entire country, this upcoming season. And I just named what 6 or 7 wide receivers. So someone's probably going to be a little disgruntled, feeling like they should be getting more targets. But as you said, the skill position at Florida, there are no shortage of weapons for DJ Lagway to throw to. This is probably the deepest group of wide receivers that Florida has had in the Billy Napier era. And it's going to be really interesting to see who emerges to the top or maybe who is kind of left behind wanting more a little bit, because you can make a case for any of those guys I just mentioned to get an abundance of targets this season.
And then looking at the running back position and looking at the running back position, Jaden Ball is probably like the alpha here, right? And he could be what, second, third team All SEC this year.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that Jaden Ball still has a long way to go, which is funny to say about a guy who was so impressive as a freshman, but this is someone who still is learning the intricacies of the position. He can improve his footwork, his technique can get better. He can, fall in love with football even more. He's a really young guy, who's just scratching the surface. And when you look what he did last season, that's kind of scary to say because he was a standout rusher for Florida as a true freshman. Montreal Johnson was injured. Their second string running back, Trayon Webb, suffered a fractured tibia. And Jaden Baugh just had an abundance of opportunities last year. If we're talking about kind of the alpha or the leader in that backfield, though, I'm going to go ahead and say Jacoby Jackson because he's the oldest back in the room, a guy who suffered due to COVID. He was under recruited, had to go the JUCO route. And when Florida saw his film when he was in Pensacola, they were like, why is this guy not playing Power Four football right now? And they bring him to Gainesville, waits his turn behind Montreal Johnson, who's been, just an absolute leader for Florida the past couple of years, had over 3,000 yards on the ground, now heads to the NFL. And Jacoby, this is his year to be the number 2 back for Florida. It's going to be Jaden Ball and Jacoby Jackson. But in terms of who's leading the guys in the locker room, the veteran statesman, if you will, someone who's been a vocal leader, has been pushing guys in the weight room, talking about setting expectations in the locker room, holding guys accountable, that's Jacoby Jackson. So even if he does have a little less production this upcoming season than Jaden Baugh, this is someone who is critical to Florida's running back room. And there's some guys that are going to really benefit from his leadership. You bring in guys like Byron Lewis, who is committed to FSU. Chad Gasper is going to spend the year just recovering still and continuing to learn behind the scenes. You talk about bringing in, Duke Clark, Waltez Clark. That's a guy who I think has, in a couple of years, we're going to probably sit back and talk about Waltez Clark and say this is a guy who, if this wasn't a loaded running back room, he probably would have had a chance to get 100 carries as a freshman. He's a really talented player. And then Katie Daniels and Trayon Webb, I think, are kind of some wild cards in a sense here. Trayon Webb is coming off of that fractured tibia, but he's a really talented guy. He was your number 2 back last year behind Montreal Johnson. If he can stay healthy, he has the talent to command a ton of carries. I would not sleep on him whatsoever. And then Katie Daniels is a guy who didn't have the freshman season that he wanted. He was dealing with some injuries. He saw Jaden Baugh, the other freshman addition for Florida in the backfield, command larger carries. He's definitely hungry. So I think I just named 6 backs right there that Florida is going to have a chance to work in, which is, it's a fantastic position to take a by committee approach because not only is it going to give you different looks, teams are going to have to prepare for different players, but when those guys are making their case for the NFL, they don't have a ton of mileage on them. They have a chance to, not be so beat down in a sense. So it's an appealing system, and I think that Florida has a really good 1-2 punch in Baugh and Jacoby Jackson, and then you have a bunch of guys behind him that Florida's really high on.
And it should be a really good run game because also what the offensive line will likely provide this year. And you mentioned that the receiver position might be the deepest on the team, but when you look at the best starting bunch, it might be the offensive line. I mean, there's a lot of great players here that are returning for their senior years. Jake Slaughter at center, and then there's George at right guard, Austin Barber at left tackle, and Austin Barber. as much attention as he gets, I still think he might be a little overlooked from a national perspective. I mean, he goes up against some of the best defensive ends on a weekly basis, and he does a really good job. What are your thoughts on this offensive line? Do you think it could be a top 10 offensive line in the nation?
Oh, I do think so. Yeah, I think that the talent that they're returning and who they're going to insert at right tackle and the depth that they have at the position, those factors right there, I think that this is going to be a top 10 offensive line in the country. You mentioned bringing back 4 or 5 starters. Jake Slaughter was the best center in college football last year. Probably we're talking about him being drafted pretty early if he goes in the 2025 NFL draft, but he never thought about leaving, comes back, wants to finish what he started. A guy who grew up a Gator and now is a leader here at Florida, was definitely slept on as a recruit. But as you know, offensive line is probably the toughest position to evaluate on the recruiting trail. And so, someone who absolutely looks like a fantastic take for Florida in retrospect. Austin Barber started as a second-year player at right tackle, but he grew up dreaming of wanting to play left tackle. We'll see where he ends up playing at the next level. I mean, I think that you get the NFL and you're going to do anything you can to stay in the NFL. You're going to play wherever they want to play you, right? But a guy who I think has kind of answered questions about whether he can be a true left tackle at the next level. I mean, I think he's improved as he's progressed, in his career. I think he's made strides each year, and he's been dealing with injuries for the last 3 years. If this is a guy who can stay healthy, that's not going to keep him off the field because we saw him continually play injured time and time again, whether it was his shoulder or his ankle. He's played through injuries, and I'm sure there's some ones we don't even know about. So this is someone who I think gives Florida a fantastic piece at left tackle, a leader within the building as well. You get Najee Harris coming back for his second full season as a starter. It wasn't the best season that he could have had last year, but a guy who's really, really young going into his third season at Florida, second season as a starter, you expect him to make some strides. He's continually improved his body and his technique and his hand placement. And I think that you're going to see Florida really benefit from that. Damian George surprised so many people last year because when he moved from right tackle to right guard, there were all these people who were saying this is not going to work out. If he wasn't a right tackle, if he was a right guard last year, why wasn't he playing there? But he improved his body and showed that he probably is a guard moving forward. I think that is absolutely something that we can look back from last year and say has been validated because he was able to handle interior defensive linemen a lot better than he was able to handle the quick guys off the edge. So I do think that getting him back, there was initially a belief that he was going to enter the portal. He comes back to Florida, gives of the guys that I just mentioned, maybe the highest ceiling is Bryce Lovett, who is going to take over at right tackle for Florida. That's a guy who can play every position on the offensive line. He has insane wingspan. He's going to need to continue developing physically, but who's not, right? I think that if he can keep doing that, how good he looked when he took the field last year, if he can build on that, this is someone that, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but in a couple of years, we could look back and be like, Bryce Lovett is one of the best offensive linemen in the SEC. I mean, I think this is a guy who has a tremendously high ceiling, and now he's going to add to Florida's offensive line starting rotation and take over for Brandon Crenshaw Dixon. I think it's going to give Florida a little bit more mobility on, at the tackle position, which I think is going to certainly help protect DJ Lagway. And yeah, absolutely everything you said. This is the most impressive starting unit for the Gators. And injuries happen in this game, and you look who's behind them: Caden Jones, Fletcher Westfall, Noel Porton-Goggin, Jason Sandamella, who was the number one interior offensive lineman prospect a year ago. You look at who they have added recently in recent years as well. I mean, this is a offensive line that feels good about 11, 12 guys on the roster. And so if someone goes down, they're not in a situation where they think that there's going to be a massive drop off, maybe in terms of experience and in-game experience, but in terms of potential and skill, Florida feels really, really good about the guys they have.
So really the only question for Florida's offense this year is if Lagway will stay healthy. Because if Lagway is healthy, I mean you're looking at one of the better offensive lines in the country, a deep receiving room, and as you mentioned, one of those underclassmen will break through, at least one of them. And then you still have a couple of experienced guys at the top of the depth chart, like Eugene Wilson. We'll see if he stays healthy as well. And then Sturdivant coming in from UCLA. The running back room is deep and explosive. I mean, is that true? Like, if Lagway stays healthy, there's a very high ceiling for this offense.
Absolutely. I don't think the offense is nearly as much of a question as Florida's defense, honestly. I think that there are more questions on defense. And I know I've talked so much already about the offense, and I'll try and hit every concern that Florida has on defense. But I do think that the offense, they're going to be able to score this season. I think that if you ask any Florida fan, and some of them are a little more negative than others, but they're all opinionated, they would tell you that the offensive questions are going to lie with the coaching staff more than the talent available. Is Florida's coaching staff going to be able to maximize all the talent that Florida has at its disposal? I think that's one of the biggest questions facing this Florida team this season.
Well, you mentioned the defense probably has more questions, and so we'll look over to the defensive side of the football here. So Tyreek Sapp returns at defensive end. Caleb Banks returns at defensive tackle. There are some questions in regards to some of the new faces, especially at the interior spot. So take me through this defensive line. Do you think it could be improved from last year, or is it still a question?
I think it remains to be seen. I think you get back Tyreek Sapp and Caleb Banks. Obviously, that's two guys right there who could end up being first round NFL draft picks. And then you add George Gums, who a guy who's still scratching the surface of how good he can be, coming back for his second year of SEC football, where he was fantastic last year. That's three guys right there who I think are going to be pivotal for Florida. But the questions are elsewhere, right? Are they going to have enough depth at the edge position? Because you have guys who they're very high on, like freshman Jaden Woods and Kofi Asari, who they just brought in from the transfer portal from UMass. But you lose guys like Jack Pyburn, TJ Searcy, a couple others in the mix there last season. They're going to need to stay healthy there. And then I think the big question also is the interior of the defensive line. You lose Desmond Watson, you lose Cam Jackson. You're going to rely on probably, Jamari Lyons, who's coming back from injury. He had a fractured ankle last year, coming back from injury to probably be your starter at nose tackle. And then you have Makai Barrow, a guy who transformed his body last year, now is a sophomore, but saw the field at a high rate last year, considering being a freshman. He's probably going to be a guy who's in the mix right there as well. But do they have enough depth along the interior of the defensive line? And then I think that sticking with the front seven, not to jump ahead of you and move to the linebackers, I mean, you're going to see Florida have to have someone else other than Shamar James, who has been a mainstay at Florida throughout the Billy Napier era, started as a freshman. You're going to have to replace him now. He's a guy who's headed to the NFL. And, they get Grayson Howard back, who was really good last year. Pup Howard was super good. But you're going to have to rely on an underclassman alongside him, whether it's Miles Graham, who I believe is going to be the guy who starts at that Mike linebacker spot for Florida, or whether it's going to be Aaron Childs, who I think is going to be in the rotation as well. And then you have Jaden Robinson right there as well. But losing Shamar James, they're replacing their leading tackler from the past couple of seasons. And, that's going to be a question for Florida. So the front seven, I think it remains to be seen if they're going to be better or whether they're going to take a step back. But there's certainly some questions to answer and some guys that they're going to have to make sure that they can replace, guys who are headed to the NFL. And anytime you're going to replace NFL talent, I think it's fair to wonder if there's going to be a drop off there.
And then looking in the defensive secondary, so Devin Moore, Cormani McLean, who had one of the best springs of all Gator players, and then Bryce Thornton at free safety. There is more to be relied upon, at least early on in the secondary. There seems to be more known entities in the back end than there is in the front six, front seven for the Gators defense. But take me through this secondary from an entire depth perspective. Is this a trustworthy unit this fall, you think?
I think the secondary is probably the biggest question facing the Florida Gators this season. I've written this elsewhere, and I've made this point to people that I think that you're looking at maybe the bar being elevated, but I think there's also the potential for a step back. Jason Marshall Jr., before he went down last season, he was fantastic in man coverage. He was probably the best cover corner in man coverage, for the first 7 games or whatever before he suffered that dislocated shoulder. He was, grading out over 92 by PFF. This is someone who I think is, there's a reason he's now in the NFL with the Miami Dolphins. And Devin Moore, they're going to need him to stay healthy. That's probably been the biggest knock on Devin Moore. It's not talent. His availability has been the question mark with him. He's going to need to stay healthy because if not, you're turning to a couple of guys that, yeah, they're really high on at corner. They added some talented quarters like Ben Hanks, a legacy guy who I think has a chance to, be a ball hawk and see the field as a freshman this season for Florida. But then you're talking about, yeah, Cormani McLean, guy stepping into a large role. Yeah, it's been a big spring for him, and he's added, size to his frame. He's up over 180 pounds now. He's hitting 23 miles per hour. But can you rely on him all season long? He's going to have to show that, right? I don't think we can sit here and say it's definitely going to happen. And then Dijon Johnson is someone who is competing with Cormani for that second corner spot opposite Devin Moore. So that's a big question right there as well. Jordan Castell, I know he didn't have the season that he wanted there at safety. He's going to have to continue improving and, playing more physical at times. Bryce Thornton, I think, is a guy who really came on at the end of the season. He's going to need to do it the entire season. I think that Triquez Bridges was so huge for that secondary last year, and not having him, that was a reliable guy last year. And these younger guys, and even some of the guys that have played from the jump, like Jordan Castell, they're going to need to showcase that this secondary is going to limit explosives and not take a step back. But of the positions in Florida secondary, the biggest question for me is at the star nickelback position for Florida, because they had Aaron Gates go down with a torn ACL. Actually was a little worse than your normal torn ACL from what I've heard. Is he going to be ready for the start of fall camp for the season opener? He goes down with an injury in late November. Is he going to be ready by August? I think that remains to be seen. He was your guy there at that star position last season. And then Sharif Denson, a guy who also had off-season surgery, should be fully healthy. I think he already is fully healthy right now and can participate in OTAs. But those are two guys that split the role. If Gates is unavailable, they're going to need to rotate and rely on someone like Josiah Davis, who has not seen the field right now. So Florida certainly is, they have talent in the secondary, and they added an impressive group of freshman guys in the secondary from, Drake Stubbs, who was a guy who was looking at Miami and FSU and several other, top programs out there. Lagonza Hayward, they flipped him from Tennessee late in the cycle. They're really high on both those guys in the third level of the defense. But I do think that it has probably the most question marks of any position on Florida's team. I'm really interested to see how it shakes out. There is, I don't want to be all doom, but there is a chance that this unit takes some steps forward, even though they have new position coaches and a lot of guys that they're going to need to have players step up and replace.
So, Graham, overall, what do you think the expectation should be this coming fall for the Gators with such a difficult schedule once again?
I mean, I think Florida should be able to compete, right? I think that, they need to showcase that what happened last year is not going to happen again. They can't come out flat and lose their first two Power Five games, Power Four games. They need to make sure that they play the way that they played down the stretch last year from the jump. And if they do that, the schedule sets up so much more favorably. I think you have a Miami team that is going to take a step back from an offensive standpoint. If you play better defense and you get all the talent out of that offense that we just talked about, you have a chance absolutely to beat Miami. And, you got to face Texas early on, but Florida State is beatable. Without, that injury to Lagway, the Gators had a 10-point lead over Georgia last year in early November. If they can come out of this season, with 4 losses or maybe even 9-3, I think that they're going to be in the college football playoff. I mean, if you go 9-3 with Florida's schedule, I think there's an argument to be made. So I think that's the expectation for Florida fans. They got to build on last season, and that means getting to 8 or 9 wins in the regular season.
Well, really good job today previewing the Gators, Graham. We appreciate you being on the channel, and we look to have you on the channel again this time next year.
Let's do it, man. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.